Hello railway and simulator enthusiasts, and welcome back on the series of tutorials on how to drive a train in France. Today we are in part 4 of this tutorial series and the last of them, and today we'll learn how to use the TVM. So in French, the TVM stands for Transmission Voie Machine, which literally means track to machine transmission. So more about this system. The TVM is an in-cab signaling system used in France, the UK, Belgium, and maybe less known but also used in South Korea for high-speed trains. Obviously being that the channel tunnel links France and the UK through the high-speed 1 on the UK side and the North high-speed line in France, the channel tunnel also uses this system. The TVM relays information via a track circuit, and there can be one or several track circuits per block. More details on that later in the video. A particularity of the TVM is that each block is represented by a single board, a concept that will later be used by the ETCS. This system is also compatible with classic signaling, which includes back signaling using the KVB safety system. Although both run at the same time, one line can be equipped by both. It is also important to note that the TVM can also be used on lines signaled with the ETCS. The TVM also includes two versions. The TVM 300, which was the first version developed in the 70s with the TGV Southeast project, later developed into the TVM 430, which includes additional indications. For the purpose of this guide, we'll mostly focus on the 430 version of the TVM. I will still mention some of the specifics of the 300 version. So here are two examples of usage of the TVM. On the left is from a cab of a Euroduplex TGV that can also actually have the ELZB if you notice the U light on the right. This TVM display is a digital one and the most recent of them. On the right is the classic TVM display used in this case in a simulator in South Korea. So now let's talk about the boards. They are the main trackside marker that you will have to use when driving under the TVM. This is the classic TVM board that you will see on the high-speed line from Marseille to Avignon and on the southeastern high-speed between Ebbsfleet and London St Pancras International. This board is called a repère TVM in French, or TVM marker. It acts as a signal head and symbolizes the block limits, so it is the most important marker when driving under the TVM. As I'll later explain in detail, if you see this board and are running under a restrictive aspect on the TVM, you must stop in front of this board, as it is like a signal. So if you remember my signaling guide on part 1 of this series, you will remember that signals have a board under them. This is the same for the TVM. In France, those can have the NF or F board the same way that the main signals have them. NF still means non franchissable, which cannot be passed, and F, franchissable, which can be passed. Those are used in France and Belgium to some extent. In the UK and South Korea, those are different. South Korea uses NP as in non-permissive. The UK uses N for non-permissive. Both use P for permissive. The indications are the same. Non-permissive means that you cannot pass the signal if you're running under a danger aspect on the TVM, and permissive means that you can pass it, with caution. In this instance, we'll use this TVM marker with an NF board for now. In France, the TVM can also be supplemented with this small light. If you remember part 1 of this guide, you will remember the little icon that can be present on an NF type signal represents the permission to pass this signal if it's showing a restrictive aspect. So in other words, this is the same thing. It is a clearance to pass if the light is lit up. In the UK, this would be a signal with two lights. In some parts of this guide, I will refer to the most restrictive TVM type as an NF one, but remember that it also means N in the UK, or NP if you're using a South Korean simulator. The next one is this one. In France, it is a purple square with a white arrow. In the UK, as I recall, it has a different shape, but it means the same thing. In France, this means carré violet, or purple square. It also means shunting limit. The meaning is the same. Stop if you are shunting. If you're a shunting movement, you must not pass this board. Some of those boards have a white light, especially if they're in front of a switch. This is the clearance to start shunting from this switch onwards. Running in France, before entering the TVM, you might be running under classic signaling. That means if you see this board, you know that you're approaching a zone which uses in-cab signaling. If you remember my part 2 of the guides on how to drive a train in France, you will remember that a black writing in a white board means that this is a distant board, so it is a warning that you are about to enter a line with an in-cab signaling. In France, this means TVM or ETCS, as though some lines have ETCS instead of TVM. This same indication also exists on all the lines with a TGV written on it. They're always placed before a signal, and they're mounted on the millitons that indicate that you are approaching a signal. The signal is this kind. It is a cab execution, white marking on a black board, which means that you are entering this in-cab signaling if you can pass this signal. From this point, if you're running under TVM, it should start from this point onwards. The same as before, it also exists with the TGV marking on it. When you approach the end of the in-cab signaling area, you will see this board. And it also means that there is the first classic signal 100 meters behind it, obviously using KVB train protection system. Those are the UK version of those. They're regular squares with the black cab writing on a white board. It is crossed when it is the end of the in-cab signaling. You will see those when coming out and in of London St Pancras International, respectively. Same for Ebb Street. Now that we've talked about the boards, let's talk about what the TVM is all about, really. It's about a display that you see inside the cab, as it is an in-cab signaling display. You will see all of the information from the inside of your train. For the purpose of this guide, and as this is the type that is used on the Marseille to Avignon high-speed line, I will use a classic display. The classic display in the TGV duplex has 12 cells in each line over 2 lines. The first line, in reality, is the standard line. This is normally the only line that you would use in normal operation. The second line acts as a backup if the first one fails. So to make matters simple, I will only use one line to display the TVM aspects. To tell you about the placing of the different aspects, on the left, in cells 1 to 3, can only be green lights with black numbers. Those are used to indicate voie libre or clear track. In the cells 4 to 6, in the classic display, would be rotated squares by 45 degrees in white with black numbers to make annonce or warning aspects. In cells 7 to 9 can be black squares with white numbers indicating the execution, the point at which a speed limit applies. There can also be red squares with 0. This is called zero cabin or cabin 0. There can also be simple red squares, and those are rouge cabine or cabin red. And on cells 10 to 12 are auxiliary indication. We will review those last. Now let's imagine that you're doing a normal line running. This is on your TVM display. Cell 1 to 3, 300, green cells with black numbers. Remember what this means. It means voie libre or clear track to 300 km per hour. So you can proceed at that speed, as it is the maximum allowed speed for your train on this line. It's also important to note that this is the max speed if you're running on the TVM 300, the max speed for the TVM 430 being 320 km per hour. So you must follow the speed at all times. There is of course a tolerance from the TVM system in case you exceed that speed limit, but if you exceed it too much, then the emergency brakes will apply. In the TVM 300, in practice, the real control is at 315 km per hour, 15 km per hour higher than the announced speed most of the time. In the TVM 430, those are different, but they're a bit more complicated and I don't have the formula for that. But in general, you should try and avoid not exceeding 15 km per hour higher than the announced speed at all times. So this aspect can start blinking and play a sound to call for attention. This means you must expect a speed reduction at the next TVM marker. So now, you're passing the next TVM marker. This changes with a sound to 270 in cells 4 to 6 with white squares and black numbers. This is an annonce or warning to 270 km per hour. This is only used to call the driver to slow down. This cannot be displayed permanently. So you need to slow down to 270 km per hour before the next TVM marker. In the TVM 300, the TVM only expects you to be at 270, or in reality at 285 or less at the next marker. In the TVM 430, you need to do that under a braking curve. The TVM 430 calculates your train braking capability, the track geometry, and the speed difference. So from this point, in the TVM 430, you must apply a strong enough braking to stay under that braking curve and prevent the emergency brakes from being applied. So stay under that braking curve at all times. So now, this aspect has fallen back to 270, clear track, maximum line speed for your train. Now this starts blinking again at the next TVM marker. Next TVM marker, this is shown. A 220 announce, a warning, which is blinking. So you need to slow down to 220 km per hour before the next TVM marker, but as it is blinking, you must also expect a new speed restriction after this one. That only happens in the TVM 430. In the TVM 300, this cannot display blinking aspects, so you cannot know what comes next. Although in this case, you know that the next speed limit at the next TVM marker is 220 km per hour at most. But as we're running under the TVM 430, this is blinking. Next TVM marker. It stops blinking, but it displays 160. So, slow down to 160, as it is the next speed limit. Next, this shows black with white numbers 160 on cells 7 to 9. So this is an execution to 160 km per hour. So this is the point at which a temporary speed restriction is enforced. Maintain 160 km per hour or less until the end of the speed zone, generally a station or switches. So now we continue further and it starts blinking. So we need to do what? Expect a speed reduction from this point, as at the next TVM marker, this will display a lower speed limit. An 80 blinking, so slow down to 80 and expect a further speed restriction. At the next TVM marker, the TVM aspect changes to this one. Still from cells 7 to 9, red squares with black zeros. As said in the introduction, this signal aspect is called the zero cabin or cabin 0. You need to be ready to stop at the next TVM marker from this point. It is used in the following situation. If the switch after the next TVM marker is set against your train's direction of travel. If the next block is the last one before an occupied block. More details on that later. The last of the situation is if the next block has one of its track circuits other than the first one occupied by an obstacle, switch or train. Again, more details on that on the block part of the TVM later. But still, if the next TVM marker bears an NF port or equivalent, it must not be passed. Reminder, NF can also be N in the UK or NP in South Korea. In the TVM 300, you would be controlled if your speed is higher than 170 km per hour, should your last indication have been 160 km per hour, which means that if you got in sequence 160 warning blinking and cabin 0, then your maximum allowed speed in practice is 170 and in theory 160 km per hour. Similar rules apply if your previous indication was an 80 blinking, just like in our situation. Then the control speed is 90, but that's only in the TVM 300. Same as before, if you're running at the TVM 430, then your train will control a braking curve. Now the last main aspect that we have to review is if you have only red squares. This is called rouge cabine, or cabine red. Whenever you see this aspect on the TVM display, then it is the order to proceed on site at no more than 30 km per hour. Remember what proceed on site means. You need to be ready to stop at any moment if you see an obstacle, another train, or the next marker. Same as the cabin 0, if the next TVM marker has an NF board or equivalent, you cannot pass it if you're running under this aspect. The TVM 300 will control your speed at 35 km per hour, as your theoretical speed is no more than 30 km per hour. Next aspect is this one, at cell number 10. If you remember the part 2 of this series of guides, then you would recall that this calls for baisser panto, or lower pantograph. In the TVM display, this indicates that you are going to enter a zone at which the current changes. So you need to operate this procedure. Cut the traction first, then open your MCB, your main circuit breaker, then lower your pantograph. Imagining that we're running under the 25 kV currents and that the next one is the 1.5, you would be able to re-raise the 1.5 pantograph and close and rearm the MCB after passing this board, the rev board, and when the indication is off, and that is only for reversible trains, so it applies to the TGV. If you were running a locomotive, you could do that earlier, but this is beyond the scope of this video. The next is at cell number 12. It reads sec with a small t twice. It may have a different aspect on different TGVs, like on the Euroduplex with the screen. This reads section in reality, and it says couper courant or cut power, a cut power order. It simply means that you are approaching a neutral section. You would not need to worry if you're running under the TVM 430, as the process of opening and closing, rearming the MCB is entirely automated on the TVM 430. Under the TVM 300, you need to do that manually, so cut the traction, then open the MCB. You will be able to close and rearm the MCB when the indication turns off, still in the TVM 300. Last one at cell number 11 in this case is an orange yellowish marker that reads control vitesse. Speed control, in other words. This is what you would see when the train initiates an emergency braking procedure. And it means that the emergency brakes are being applied and the MCB is automatically opening. This happens when you break the speed limit. In other words, when you run higher than the speed limit, say at 315 or more kilometers per hour under a 300 clear track aspect, or if you do not brake enough to stay under the braking curve, this would happen. So now that you know how the TVM display works, there needs to be several more explanations as to how the TVM block works. So let's start by describing the basics of it. Under the TVM 300, you have approximately 2 kilometers between each TVM marker. In the TVM 430, thanks to its improved efficiency, this can be lowered to around 1.5 kilometers between each TVM board. An important thing to know, again, is that between each TVM board, the way your train reads the speed that it needs to hold is via a track circuit, which transmits the information trackside. There is something pretty important to know about the track circuit. This is case number 1, whereas there is basically one track circuit between two TVM markers. In other words, one track circuit for one block. Why do I say that? Because there is a second case in which there are several track circuits between two TVM markers. So, several track circuits for one block. This is important to know for later, but before that, it's important to remind that in theory, you should still have one train per block, no matter the number of track circuits on that block. So let's talk about why this is important. Let's imagine that we have 3 blocks, 4 TVM markers. They're all passable if you are running under a cabin 0 or a cabin red. And now let's imagine that on the third block, there is a train that occupies it. On the case 1, on approach of that train, your display should first show at the first block, so one block before the occupied block, a cabin 0. Let's imagine that as you can pass the next TVM marker, you do that. Then the TVM would show a cabin red. This is the first case in which you use the cabin 0, then the cabin red. You will always have a cabin red one block before the next occupied block, providing that each block has a single track circuit, by the way. This would be called the buffer block. It is to further lower the risk of running into another train, as the TVM does that by slowing you down one block before the next occupied block. Theoretically, you can still pass the next TVM marker and run in the same block as the one that is occupied by the other train, providing you still run at caution. Then the TVM will still show a cabin red. Now let's go through a second case. In this case, you see the train occupying the next block, and the next block has two track circuits. And important to note as well, the other train is occupying the first track circuit of the next block. If you understood the concept, then you should know that there needs to be a buffer block, one before the next, which is occupied by another train. So approaching this block, you would do that under a cabin red. Providing that you pass the second TVM marker on the screen, you would still run under a cabin red. The train in front of us, however, has nothing in front of him, so the moment he will enter the next track circuit, he would be running at 320 clear track aspect on the TVM. So now let's say that the train enters the second track circuit. You would have a cabin red under both track circuits if you were running under it. But now let's say that you are approaching that second block from the first one. I would ask you to take a guess about what should your TVM be showing, as there is at least one track circuit in the block before the occupied track circuit, then your TVM will show cabin 0. The TVM does know that the next block is occupied, but only on the second track circuit. The first track circuit will display a cabin red, show you be on this one, but the one before, which is at the previous block, would therefore display a cabin 0. There is a third case, in which there is this time 3 track circuits in the same block, and the train is occupying the third track circuit. This time, it might seem a bit weird to some of you, because there is a cabin red under all of the track circuits. But this is because the TVM knows that all of those track circuits are under the same block. For restrictive indications, the TVM only considers the block. So even if you have 5 different track circuits under a very long block of 6 kilometers, theoretically, even though that's not supposed to happen, all of those track circuits, even if the train occupies the very last one, should display a cabin red to your train, and the one before, the block before, should display a cabin 0. This story of track circuit leads to one last interesting case, this time for permissive aspects, and it is that less restrictive indications, permissive aspects, can be displayed at any point that allows it. So let's say that in theory, you're running on the first block under a 270 clear track aspect on your TVM. You enter the next block on the first track circuit, and the speed is still 270 for this line. But in the middle of that block, the line speed jumps up to 320. Well, entering the second track circuit, your TVM can display 320 clear track and will jump to that when you enter the second track circuit. With all of that said, you still need to be ready to stop under a cabin 0 indication, and you still need to drive on site under a cabin red, and lastly, you need to stop at any NF, N, or NP marker under a cabin 0 or red. The previous cases were only done under permissive aspects from the TVM boards. You still need to consider if the TVM board is a permissive one or not. The only exception is when the non-permissive TVM aspect has a white light lit up to it, or two in the UK. One last thing before we end this video. The TVM accounts for the train specific, which includes weight, braking capability, and train max speed. The TVM isn't only capable of showing the max line speed, it can also show the max train speed. So say the line speed is 320, but you're running a locomotive that can only go at 200 km per hour, then the TVM would display 200. In other cases, it would display VL for voie libre, which means that you can run at the maximum allowed speed for your train on this track. And let's say that hypothetically, the TVM would display a warning to any TGV that can run on this line. To account for the train specifics, the TVM might tell you to slow down to 160 at that point. And this was all there is to know about the TVM. You can now use the Marseille to Avignon TGV, or the extension from Avignon to Lyon, and the Southeastern High Speed line. Thank you very much for following this series of guides, and have a good one. Safe drive!